My name is Dr. Rachael Pasierowska, and I hold a dual PhD from Rice University in Texas and also the Universidade Estadual de Campinas, which is in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. Right now, I'm working at Lincoln University, which is in Missouri, and so it's just after around 7 a.m. here. But I'm feeling good to go, and it's nice to see some people from the homeland and to hear some home accents. So my presentation today is entitled Bre'r, Rabbit, and Blue Fox in African American Storytelling, as Education of Enslaved Children in the Antebellum U.S. South to Linguistic Approaches in Pedagogy Today. And I finish off with a couple of possible questions for discussion. In particular, it would be very exciting for me to learn how people teach some of the points that I'm going to talk about in different countries. Looking at my presentation outline, I'm going to begin with a very brief introduction to the Bre'r Rabbit stories for the purposes of time. I want to look at links to Africa, African roots, and I'm going to focus a lot on education. So my third point is looking at stories and education during slavery. Number 4, reproduction of Bre'r Rabbit stories through the 19th to the 20th centuries. 5th, teaching Bre'r Rabbit stories in the 20th century. And then I have some closing remarks. So looking at the introduction to the Bre'r Rabbit stories. These stories were typically passed down through generations. And this is very important when we look at time, and I will allude to this a little bit later. Many of these interviews were collected by several people across the United States. I will also refer to this later on some of the biases. One of the collectors, Joe Chandler Harris, was white, and this is presented or presents us as historians with a very large bias and how we use these sources. Many of the sources that I have are from the Works Progress Administration interviews. And these interviews, what is interesting about them is one of the primary critiques is looking at the younger age at which the interviewees experienced slavery. And when we're looking at stories, this can actually act as a positive, especially when we look at memory and arguments with respect to people in older age having clearer memories of childhood. The stories were often directed to children's ears, and they focus on central protagonists, predominantly Bre'r Rabbit, but also other characters. Bre'r Rabbit is sometimes referred to as Boo Rabbit, Brother Rabbit, and Bre'r Rabbit. And the stories incorporate animals and draw upon typical characteristics of certain animals. And a lot of my research over here in the US looks at why different peoples from across the Atlantic world placed similar characteristics onto animals. And one thing about the rabbit I'll look at later is speed and such. There's just a quick slide on African roots. So trickster stories have existed, have a very, very long history. We see them in European, African, Indigenous American cultures. And I note these purely because these are the areas, some of the areas that I focus on. We see that of around 220 stories, around half of these hold African roots, predominantly from West Africa, but also from Central West Africa. There are a lot of connections that come from the Açores region around Rio de Janeiro in Brazil that also use similar examples of rabbits as tricksters. Zomo the hare, you can see in the bottom left image, a very, very bright, attractive image. You can, this book is on sale in countries across Africa. It's also on sale, in the US, on Amazon. But we see, and I'm part of the school of scholars who argue this, that Zomo the hare came across as part of the transatlantic slave trade and diaspora. Here on the right, you can see an image from the late 19th century that also looks at the character Bre'r Rabbit. So I really want to focus a lot of this presentation on education. I want to look at the example of education of enslaved children during slavery times. Those of you who might be familiar with my research will know that I look a lot at the formations of childhood identity formation. As mentioned, these stories were often directed to children's ears. Covert messages and also overt messages were contained in these stories through representations of the plantation society, and what I would argue as a microcosm. When we look deeper at plantation societies in the US, and I'll only focus on the US for the purpose of this presentation, we see in the 1700s, even into the very early 1800s, Indigenous Americans enslaved alongside indentured servants from Europe and enslaved Africans, predominantly from Africa as first generation. At the same time, during this time period, especially in the 1700s, a lot of enslaved persons to the United States came from Jamaica. So what a lot of scholars would argue, and I'm part of this camp as well, is how these stories look at learning of servile statuses during slavery for children. They talk of survival stories and resistance, perseverance and autonomy. I want to push that further. For me, we also see survival stories and resistance by people holding on to these tales. Older arguments, as some of you might be familiar with, were that focused around, especially until the 1960s, that the transatlantic slave trade, that transatlantic voyage across the North Atlantic was so devastatingly traumatic for enslaved Africans that they forgot their identities, large parts of their identities. Of course, now we know that it's not true, but I feel it's still important to look at. Now, when you look at the stories in the United States, something that is very important in this context is how change over time takes place. By this, I mean, in 1808, the United States abolishes the transatlantic slave trade, 1 year after England. However, the United States does not abolish slavery until Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. I just always feel that I need to make an aside here that enslaved persons, people of African descent, continue to remain in servile statuses, in Indigenous American territories. And I just think that's a big point for me to make. That's just my personal opinion, that it's important to share that when I say slavery was abolished and enslaved persons of African descent were freed in 1865. It didn't apply to everybody in the country. When I look at change over time or continuation over time, we see, for instance, how these stories were passed down. We know that the illegal slave trade continued and that enslaved Africans did continue to arrive in the United States. However, this was on a much, much smaller scale. When we look at this as being relatable to a child audience, it also brings into consideration who might have been the storyteller. We see a lot of links back to West African, in particular, storytelling cultural practices in relation to the education of children and other members of the community. And I'm very much focusing here on slavery on a slave plantation. So I want to give an example as a short case study, just to illustrate how I look at the stories within my work and how I work with these stories to try and better understand different parts of enslaved persons' lives, identities, and especially among children, identity formation. we see frequent appearances of Bre'r Possum. In one story, he loses all of his hair on his tail in a skirmish with a bear. You can see here in the image on the right, there's a fluffy possum, and he has this bald tail that sometimes to me looks a little bit like an armadillo tail. In another story, he ends up in the fireplace, he's in a cooking pot after being tricked by the other animals. He's getting ready to become dinner. And some of these stories, I know those who will be speaking about Anansi, they're similar stories. Anansi tricking others into a cooking pot or being tied to a piece of wood or something so that he's not able to escape. So when we look at this, we see immediately that Bre'r Possum is a character who is presented as lacking intelligence, easy to fool, easy to capture in a sense. I want to look at this then further and how it links to my research. What we see here in this instance is a story about Bre'r Possum. A lot of people would argue, and I myself are of this school, that Bre'r Rabbit and sometimes other characters in the Bre'r Rabbit stories represent enslaved persons. They look at this fight toward independence, autonomy, self-expression, and such. What I look at in my research is how many enslaved families, and this brings in arguments of masculinity, worked very hard to supplement their diets. Now, when the Works Progress Administration interviews took place in the 1930s, a lot of people were experiencing the Great Depression. A lot of people, former enslaved persons, were struggling greatly from hunger. So a lot of these stories tell us about great hunger in the contemporary period during the Great Depression when these interviews were taking place. At the same time, we hear a lot of stories about eating possums on a Sunday, for instance, that their parents might have cooked up, the mother, older siblings, aunts, grandmothers had cooked up with roasted sweet potatoes, pot liquor, so kind of a stock, a broth, and how these were some of the greatest memories that they have of food during this time period. And when we see bringing together of communities and such. Now, possums are very, very high in protein as a protein source. There seems to be a plethora of possums when I was living in Texas, also here in Missouri. It's quite common to see possums, even though they're more nocturnal. They reproduce at quite a quick rate. And just randomly, if you ever Google a picture of a possum, they have a reputation of being pretty ugly. But if you Google a picture of them with the little babies hanging on their back, I think you can be convinced that they're very, very sweet. In the Works Progress Administration interviews, we see a lot of vocabulary about treeing an opossum. So treeing a possum and such. When we look at this, one way in which enslaved persons treed these possums to eat and such was by rearing and training dogs, which were called possum dogs, possum hounds and such. Now, this could go into another conversation about how we see a juxtaposition here between slaveholders and overseers using dogs to chase enslaved persons. I'm not going to go into that aspect of research today. What I want to focus on is how enslaved persons often shared their own dogs. They spent a lot of time training their dogs to hunt for possums. And so the notion of treeing a possum brought in various members of a male community, from little children who might scale up these trees to collect the possums who had been chased into the trees by dogs, net them and such. So I want to look at the reproduction of these stories through the 19th to the 20th centuries. So Joel Chandler Harris created a collection known as Uncle Remus stories. Now, Harris spent time with enslaved persons, learning songs, stories, and dialects until emancipation. It's really important when I'm teaching this and when I'm writing about this to be very, very upfront and acknowledge that Joel Chandler Harris was a white person. He was working not as an overseer, he was not a slaveholder, he wasn't a very wealthy person. He worked as an editorial assistant for a number of newspapers. Arguably, the characters were based on people in Harris's life, and he creates or he draws upon stories that include a character named Uncle Remus. This term in itself has a lot of criticisms. Even when you look at the interviews in the 1930s, a lot of the people who were being interviewed were referred to as auntie, uncle, and such. And there's been a lot of criticism toward that about not naming people, for instance, by just their first names, but calling them uncle, for instance, as opposed to, for instance, Mr. Remus. Uncle Remus, then, using Joel Chandler Harris's terms, was a narrator. He's portrayed as an elderly former enslaved man working for former slaveholders. This is very, very important. When we see the movie portrays this in an instance in the time of slavery. The stories are reproduced during the Reconstruction, or they're set, in the Reconstruction period. They're also, for the majority, written by Joel Chandler Harris in the Reconstruction period. And this is from the end of the Civil War, from 1865 until 1877. Now, I'm going to read through this citation. It's one that when I'm teaching, I like to focus on a lot. It's a very, very rich citation. And this is included in one of the preludes to Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus stories. I cite, "My purpose has been to preserve the legends themselves in their original simplicity and to wed them permanently to the quaint dialect, through the medium of which they have become a part of the domestic history of every Southern family. And I have endeavored to give to the whole a genuine flavor of the old plantation." I'm just going to draw on a couple of things here and things that I look at when I'm teaching. We see words such as original simplicity, legends, the quaint dialect. They have become a part of the domestic history of every Southern family. And when we're looking at every Southern family, is he writing for a white audience? Is he writing for all audiences who are reading these across the United States? And then finally, I've endeavored to give to the whole a genuine flavor of the old plantation. And a massive critique, and this also comes through when I look briefly at the Disney movie, The Song of the South, is that this is a very, very distorted view of times under slavery. So moving into Walt Disney's The Song of the South, I'm not sure how many people have seen this. It would be very, very interesting to see, maybe to discuss it in the Q&A section. But it was based on the works by Joel Chandler Harris. It was released in 1946. It's a little bit of the style of Mary Poppins in the sense that it has, we see live action alongside the sort of small characters, these little animals and such, working along together and in conversation with each other. It portrayed, as I mentioned, this idyllic Southern plantation life. But as I mentioned, it was set during the Reconstruction period. Immediately after the film is released, and of course this is during times of segregation, the NAACP published articles on this and reports about how the movie has distorted facts and portrays a very dangerously glorified picture of slavery. Uncle Remus is presented as being non-threatening to white audiences, and Joel Chandler Harris looks at this in his work. The movie was removed from airing in the United States and then later worldwide in the early 2000s. I remember watching this when I was a child. We had a VHS. I know it's a historical document now in itself, but I remember watching this. I called it the Zippity-Doo-Dah movie. That's all I can say from my memories as a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old about the film, but I wanted to watch the Zippity-Doo-Dah movie. I had no idea to what it was referring. I didn't remember that, and I had no context from a British audience from growing up in Britain what it might have meant. Would I have understood it at that age? That's another question for discussion. So now looking at the 21st century, and this looks more at my work. So we see the importance of biases in the stories and in the Works Progress Administration interviews. Some of these biases, a large amount, 3/4 of these interviews were collected by white interviewers. A lot of these interviewers had no experience in oral history in collecting interviews. What also is important are the following 3 variables: student body, geographical regions across the United States, and generational histories of students. And note that I have not taught these stories in the United Kingdom. I have only taught these stories in a US setting, as an English person, a British person as well at that. So when we're looking at student body, geographical regions, and generational histories of students, it is very important to note that every school in the United States have different student bodies, have different identities. An example would be, I just moved from the University of Iowa. My audience was very, very white and rural. A lot of people did not have direct histories tied to slavery. They were unfamiliar with these stories and slavery in general. Right now, where I've just started work, I'm at a historically Black school. It was founded in 1866, and it was a school that was founded by African Americans, and it was a school aimed at educating former enslaved persons. So I'm also navigating the world right now of my new location in how to teach these stories and looking at people's generational histories who have experienced possibly listening to these stories as they've been passed down. So in conclusion, I would be very interested to hear how people relate to these stories, teach these stories in different countries, and also their experiences with stories and looking at childhood education and such. So thank you for your time.